Hello, welcome to the big picture of Chinese history. This will be a series of videos focused on those Chinese historical figures and pivotal events. But it's not only about those historical issues, and also about how those things shaped the modern China. And this is the episode 1. Basically, something happened before the 21st century BC, the first Chinese dynasty, the Xia dynasty. And the early Chinese history can be told by combining two different kinds of narratives, the archaeological narrative and the historical narrative. So today, let's talk about something we call historical narrative, but it's not recorded history. It's actually something about legend, about myths. So basically, 4 most important, most famous mythologies. Okay, let's begin. The first one is called Pangu creating the heaven and the earth. This is basically the most fundamental myth of the Chinese civilization. It is said at the beginning, there was nothing in the world but chaos, and a giant who was sleeping inside an enormous egg, which is very dark. And someday, this giant named Pangu just woke up and he felt, this is way too small, right, man? So he grabbed an egg and just split this egg into 2 different parts, the lighter parts as well as the heavier parts. And the heavier part just sank and sank, went down, and finally became the earth. Well, the lighter part just rose up and finally became the heaven. And Pangu decided to hold the heaven by his body. He just held his heaven. Many years later, he felt so exhausted and he just slept. Or you can say he died. Finally, his body literally changed into the world. Like his limbs became the mountains. His hair became the forest, while his 2 eyes became the moon and the sun. And even his blood became river, and his breath became the wind. So Pangu himself became the natural world. And that remind me of something in ancient Greek mythology. Like when Zeus defeated the Titan god, and he forced a Titan god named Atlas to just hold up the sky, hold up the heaven as a punishment. And Pangu did the same thing. He also held the heaven, but not as a penalty. He did this willingly. So that's the first myth. And then now we have our natural world, right? But there was no human being. So let's move on to the second one. And Pangu was considered as a god, as a male character. There was another goddess whose name was Nüwa. And one day Nüwa was walking on the ground, but she just felt so lonely. So she decided to make something to keep her company. And she used the yellow clay to create something called human beings. At first, he created those human beings one by one by her hands, very slowly, but everything she made was vivid, was unique, very beautiful. But one day she felt, whoa, that was too slow. So let me speed up. So she found a rope and just dig this rope into the mud and began to swinging this rope around. And finally, every drop of the mud splashed out became a human being individually. And one day, some people said, those noble class people was made by her hands, while the modern people was made by the rope. That sounds similar. That sounds like the Indian caste system, right? But it only stayed here. It not became a whole system. Besides Chinese mythology, in like Sumeru myth, there was also a god named Enki, the god of water and wisdom. He forced the birth goddess named Nüwa to creating human beings also with earthly clay. So you can see there are some parallels in different civilizations. There was no clear evidence that one civilization had borrowed their story from another. But maybe I think because our ancestors who were living in the different place were all wondering where we come from. And so maybe creating of yellow clay, which were a common and accessible material, seems like a reasonable explanation. So now you can see Pangu and Nüwa were creator, god and goddess in Chinese civilization, but they only remained in the mythological figures, not the religious god and goddess. So that's very, very interesting. That is different from Western civilization, right? Because we all learn that creator God, the story of creator God in those religious classics in Western civilization. Okay, now let's move on to the third one, which was called Hou Yi shooting the sun. It is said there was once 9 suns hanging in the sky, which makes the world unbearably hot. And there was a brave warrior, or you can see he was a fearless, powerful archer named Hou Yi. He stepped forward and used his bow and arrow to just shoot 9 of the suns down and leave only one to provide the bright and warmth what we need. As a reward, the god gave him an elixir of immortality. And Hou Yi had a very beautiful wife whose name was Chang'e. But one day, Chang'e just swallowed this elixir of immortality by mistake. Then Chang'e floated up to the moon, and finally she became an immortal goddess in the moon. For centuries, ancient Chinese people believed there was a beautiful woman whose name was Chang'e living in the moon with her lovely pet rabbit, but separated from his beloved husband forever. And what is interesting, the modern China launched several lunar probes into the moon, and you know what? The Chinese government just named those lunar probes, these machines, as Chang'e 1, Chang'e 2. It is a very romantic links between the ancient myths and the modern science, right? Now let's move to the last one, the old foolish man removing the mountains. It is that there was once an old foolish man who was very determined. He wanted to move 2 mountains away because these 2 mountains were blocking his way out of home. They felt like 2 burdens on him. And his neighborhood just asked him, how could you just want to remove these 2 mountains? They are too huge for you to remove. And this old foolish man said, I'm digging away them slowly, step by step, and I will do this work for the rest of my life. If I can make it, my son and my grandson will carry on this working. Finally, his work moved the god, and God helped him to move these mountains away. This was only a fictional story, but you know, in the 20th century, Chairman Mao Zedong just said, the Communist Party of China was like this old foolish man. And there was also 2 mountains, like 2 burdens on China. One is called imperialism and another is called feudalism. So the Communist Party's task was to slowly remove these 2 mountains out of China. And maybe finally they could move the god. And can you guess who the god is? It is not the United States and it is not the Soviet Union. But the god refers to all of the ordinary Chinese people. Okay, now we have talked about all of these 4 very famous, very important mythologies of Chinese history. And in my opinion, maybe more than 95% Chinese people have heard these 4 myths. And, you know, Pangu, Nüwa, Hou Yi and his wife Chang'e, and this old foolish man, they are all fictional figures. Okay, then let's move to another time. And we can call this time of half mythology, half history. So this was a time of 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors. They were considered basically living in about 25th century BC to 21st century BC, but it's not very precise. It was just, as I said, half mythological, half historical. And the most important emperor among them was called Huangdi, or yellow, literally means yellow emperor. And he was a leader of a tribe. And one day, his tribe had a big war against another tribe, led by another emperor called Yandi, or Yan Emperor. Finally, Huangdi won this battle. But instead of just wiping out this another tribe, Huangdi's tribe got merged together with these other tribes. So that made the early Chinese ethnic group. So now the Chinese people call themselves as the descendants of Yan and Huang, Yandi and Huangdi, Yan Emperor and the Yellow Emperor. And after Yellow Emperor, we have several capable rulers who were elected based on their merit, not by bloodline. Then we came to a ruler called Yu. And now we came to the almost the most important, also half myth, half history, called Yu the Great control the flood. Before this story, let me just talk about something about Chinese geography, the Yellow River. As you know, the Yellow River was called the mother river of Chinese civilization. The Yellow River, it stretches about 5,500 kilometers across the northern China. It was called the Yellow River because it carries out the yellow silt from the northern western China, or what we call the Losses Plateau. Since it carries the yellow silt, when it came to the lower plain, when it just float slowly, the yellow sediment, the yellow silt would deposit into the riverbed. So it makes the riverbed rise higher and higher, and someday it overflow its embankment. It often overflow its embankment, which would lead to catastrophic disaster. So this is always the biggest problem of the early Chinese civilization. So how to controlling the water, how to build the water program is the first task of the ruler of Chinese civilization at that time. And Yu, he finally make it. He and his team worked about 13 years and finally built a huge water project to control the flood. And Yu, or we can say Yu the Great, was considered as a very respectful and capable and successful ruler of Chinese history. So that reminds me of something very interesting. There was a question in Quora. It is said, why most Chinese people are non-religious? And I remember the most voted answer makes a very interesting comparison between Chinese and Western civilization. It is that when the flood came in, when the flood struck, the ancestors of Western people believed that God would rescue us, and the God guided Noah to build an ark, right? But the ancestors of Chinese people believed they must work together, and they didn't wait for the divine intervention. And they worked together. Finally, they defeat or they control the flood. So maybe that's why reason somebody called the Chinese civilization as the water controlling civilization. It's very interesting compared to Mediterranean civilization. Like when you were a man who lived in ancient Greece, if you want to live a better life, you can just find a small boat to go out on those calm Mediterranean and to work harder to have a better life. But if you were a people who lived in Yellow River Basin, who lived in ancient China, you cannot just rely on yourself to control the water, to fight with the flood. If you want to live a better life, you must join in a group. So that's maybe why the Eastern people, the Chinese people, always placed more emphasis on collectivism. So if you need to join a group, to build a huge water project, you must need a strong leader. You must need a clear hierarchy. So that's why Eastern people, not only China, but Korean, Japanese, the Eastern people always paid more attention to collectivism. Okay, let's move back to Yu the Great. When he finally succeeded in controlling the water, he did something very important in Chinese history. Remember, before him, every ruler of the tribe was elected by their merit, not by bloodline, right? But Yu the Great just passed the throne into his own son. So from him, the throne, the throne was hereditary. And he and his son Qi were considered as the beginner, as the founder of the first dynasty, Xia dynasty of Chinese civilization. Okay, this time was basically seen as in the year of 27 BC. Okay, this is the story of the first episode. And next time we will come into the first dynasty, the Xia dynasty, and we will meet a very interesting, a significant debate of the early Chinese civilization, whether the Xia dynasty really exists. So where did this exist come from? Welcome to the next episode, the Xia dynasty. See you next time.